Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video I'm going to show you how to draw mountains in colored pencil. So it's another landscape tutorial, and I'm going to use Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils on paper primed with some clear gesso. First I'm going to draw a snow-covered mountain and then a mountain in summer with some greenish tones. Let's start. I'm going to do a sketch here to demonstrate how I intend to approach this. These mountain peaks are more or less shaped like a pyramid in a lot of cases, so you can draw something like this, but it's important to understand where the light source is coming from, because if the light source is coming from the left, this right side is going to be darker. So if you know how to shade the basic objects, you can shade mountains. Now you can add some smaller shapes to that to make the overall shape a bit more complex, and that's pretty much it. As long as you're aware of the light source, it's not going to be too difficult. You can add some details to that, some variations, some rocks and things like that, but this is pretty much it. Now let's move on to the main part of the drawing process. So like I said, I'm going to be using colored pencils on this toned paper primed with clear gesso, which creates a sort of a sanded surface, which is better for layering and blending, and it allows me to work from dark to light and from light to dark as well. First I'm going to use a light gray pencil to draw the outline or the basic shape of the mountain, and then I'm going to add some lighter and darker tones as needed. And this is going to be the shape of my mountain. I'm also going to have some objects in front of it, but I'm going to get to that later. So now I'm going to do the sky, because I need to have something that the mountain would stand out against. So the sky needs to be a little bit darker than the lighter parts of the mountain here. And I used a light phthalo blue. I used a light phthalo blue pencil, and I'm going to cover the sky with that. It's a lovely blue color, but I just need to put down enough of it so that I don't have much of the background color of the paper coming through. And now I'm just going to blend that with my finger. You can use some other tools, but your finger will work just as well, because the thing is that this surface behaves differently from conventional paper, and it creates a bit more residue, and it allows you to move that pigment more easily, so you don't have to use solvents or anything. On this surface it's easier to blend, it's also easier to layer. Sometimes it's also better to rotate the drawing, because that helps you push in the pigment more easily around the edges, so that you don't smudge over the edges where you need a clean edge. Now I'm going to draw some of the shadow parts of this mountain. So I'm just going to use this grey pencil again to indicate where some of the shadow areas will be. So this is a complex shape. It's a little bit more complex than that pyramid I drew initially. It has more of these surfaces, which are some of which are facing away from the light source, and others are facing the light source, and the ones which are close to the light source or facing the light source are going to appear lighter, and the ones which are facing away from the light source are going to be darker. So just by playing around with different values, we can convey to the viewer which part of the mountain is facing the light source and which one is facing away, and that way we are creating a three-dimensional object just by using that contrast in value. To these shadow areas I'm going to add some even darker touches of this dark indigo blue color, just to create a little bit more contrast between the darker parts of the mountain and the sky, and to create a little bit of variation in the shadow area, because this is a rocky surface and I want to have a bit more texture there. I don't want some of these areas to appear too smooth, but I'm going to be refining them a little bit later. Right now I just want to add a bit more variation in texture as well as value, so that these shadow areas look a bit more natural. And now finally I'm starting to add the lighter areas, or the light side of each and every one of these surfaces, using a white colored pencil. And I'm first going into those areas which I didn't cover previously, because I designated them as the light side of the mountain. But occasionally, if I want to, I can also go over some of the darker layers, because this surface allows me to work from dark to light. So if I want to modify certain shapes or add some of these lighter bits in the middle of those shadow areas, I can still do that, and that's one of the advantages of sanded surfaces. So you can see, as I'm adding the light side of the mountain, this whole shape is starting to make a lot more sense, and it's starting to become more three-dimensional, and you can almost feel like it has depth and volume. And I'm trying to play around a little bit with some lighter and darker forms here, just to make the overall shape of the mountain a bit more interesting. But now I'm going to start adding even more of these darker touches with this dark indigo colored pencil, because on a mountain, even if it's a snow-covered mountain, you're going to have some jutting rocks or some portions of the mountains which aren't completely covered with snow, and those are going to appear darker when you look at them from a distance. Also, there may be some trees growing on the top of the mountain and stuff like that, so there's always going to be some darker details even in those snow-covered mountains. So I want to add a little bit of that variation even to the light side of the mountain, as well as the shadow side of the mountain, so that it looks more rocky, and so that the surface looks more rough and realistic. But the key to drawing mountains is drawing these sharp contrast between the shadow areas and lighter areas, kind of like when I did the drawings of those rocks in the rocks and stones tutorial, which is going to be in the end screen if you want to check it out. Now here at the bottom, I'm going to have like a little valley below these mountains, and I'm also introducing a little bit of variation in value there as well, and I'm also adding a touch of blue both to that valley and also to some of these shadow areas of the mountains, because I want a slightly more natural shadow color that is a little bit more consistent with the overall setting, the overall lighting of the scene, because I need more of those bluish tones. Now I can use a lighter pencil to go in and add a little bit of variation into those shadow areas, because even in the shadow areas there's going to be some lighter details and darker details, and I want to add some of those lighter details in addition to those darker rocks, so that, like I said, I have that range of value, and so that everything looks more realistic. And that texture is also important, because it gives you something to confuse and entertain the eye of the viewer, and make them think that they're looking at something really, really complex, but it only took a few minutes for me to do. As a finishing touch, I'm putting down some lighter details using a white pencil, and then again this dark indigo pencil, just to make the surface of some of these parts of the mountain a little bit more complex. I'm going to need a little bit more of this white pencil here at the bottom. I'm not going to draw much of the foreground here, but I do want to have some trees in front of the mountain. But before I do those, I need to have a little bit of a background. And these trees will also help me add more depth to the scene, and they will also help me hide some of the bottom parts of the mountains, which I didn't really do in much detail, because I didn't really feel like focusing on that part of the mountain. So people normally pay attention to the mountain peak, and here at the bottom you usually have some objects and some elements obscuring the lower portion of the mountain. So here I'm just going to use these trees to hide the less detailed part of the mountain here at the bottom. And of course the main purpose of these trees is to add more depth to the scene, because whenever you have an object like this which is close to the foreground and it's sticking out in front of the objects in the background, it's creating an illusion of depth. It's giving something to the viewer that they can measure distance against. And now as I'm drawing these trees in front of the mountain and even here in front of the sky, all of these objects in the foreground are sort of pushing the objects in the background further back, creating a feeling of distance and depth. Now I'm going to refine the appearance of these trees a little bit by working on their shading and their texture by adding a little bit of this black colored pencil. And this seems to be doing the trick, because I don't really need to do too much. I'm just adding some shadow areas to these canopies, making them a little bit darker in places, especially at the bottom where you expect there to be a bit more shadow. And that also creates a bit of variation in texture in that canopy, because I want to make it look like coniferous fir type of trees which have these conical shapes and clusters of needles that kind of form into this tapering tall shape. So I also need to add a little bit of shadow here in the foreground, because some of these trees will be casting a shadow from left to right, so with just a few lines or strokes we can make that part of the scene more realistic as well. I'm just adding some finishing touches to some of those rocks at the top, and just emphasizing some of these shadows. And as a final touch, just adding a little bit of the lighter green to some of the trees to have a little bit more range of value on them as well. And that should probably do it. A little bit more blue here at the bottom, just to stay consistent with the overall tone and colors. And that would be the first mountain. So I hope you liked it. And now I'm going to move on to the second one. The second scene is going to be completely different, because first of all it's going to be a mountain in summer, and we're going to have more of those green tones. And secondly, I'm going to approach the entire scene differently. I'm going to draw the sky differently. I'll get to that in a minute. First I need to draw the outline of the mountain. I'm drawing this shape using a dark green pencil. This is a chrome oxide green or something like that, so it's a fairly dark green, and that's what I'm going to start with. And this is going to be the initial outline. The light source is going to be coming from the left, like with the previous one. Now with the sky I intend to do something, or the background rather, I intend to do something slightly different. I want to stack multiple hills and mountains here in the distance, and I want to show you how the atmospheric effect works as they disappear into the distance. Now as for the sky, I'm going to make the sky a lot lighter and more grayish. So first I'm going to apply a little bit of this white pencil and blend that to have that as a sort of a base color, and then I'm going to go over that with some sky blue to make it more bluish. But this blue will be both lighter and duller in color, and also cooler than the color that I used for the first mountain. And I want it that way because I want a sort of a duller sky in the distance. Now below that I'm going to be drawing a whole bunch of mountain peaks, and what I said I want to try to do is I want to try to imitate the atmospheric effect as objects become less and less defined in the distance, and they will appear to have less and less value as you look further in the distance, and the ones which are closer to us are going to appear darker and more defined in terms of contrast and texture. So you can see that as I'm stacking these groups of mountain peaks one in front of the other, the ones that are closer to us are getting darker and darker and more defined in terms of shape. and I'm making sure that these top ridges, the top part of the ridges really stands out against the rest of the background, so that I can create some additional contrast there. And that way you can create a feeling of depth just by drawing these mountain peaks using a different amount of value, because this already feels like you're looking at a lot of the mountains in the distance, and the ones which are further away are obviously getting lighter and lighter. Now I'm also cleaning up the edge between the sky and that line of the horizon, and just making sure that some of these mountain peaks stand out. For some of the darker ones I also used a darker blue, the Prussian blue, and as a mid-tone I used a middle phthalo blue. Now I had to clean up the top of the mountain a little bit, and now I'm going to start working with some greens. The main green which I chose for my base color is the May green, which is a lighter green color with a bit of a yellowish component to it. So I'm going to use that as a base color because most of this mountain is going to appear green. Now later I'm going to add some darker colors to it. This is probably a good moment for me to remind you to give me a like and subscribe to my channel if you like my videos, and don't forget to check out my other colored pencil tutorials. Now I'm blending everything with my finger, and you can see that I've already established the light side of that mountain. So now all I need to do is work on the dark side, or the shadow side. I added a little bit of this yellowish golden color, and then a bit of the brown color, just to introduce a little bit more variation in the color of the mountain, and also add a bit more texture to it, so that these slopes appear more interesting and a bit more realistic in terms of color, because that May green is maybe good for grass, but for a surface like this we need a little bit more of those brownish tones. This will also be a wooded area. There's going to be some trees on that side as well, in addition to the shadows. And we're also going to have some scattered trees on the slopes on the left as well. I may introduce some lighter tones in here as well, because the shadows are a little bit too dark now. So I'm going to use that same dark green to indicate some shadow areas within this slope here, to add a little bit more variation to the terrain. Like for example, there's this dip in the terrain just below that peak to the left. And now I'm going to draw maybe a few trees here on this slope, again using that chromium oxide green, or whatever it is, that dark green, and a bit more of these closer to the top. So I'm just trying to increase the contrast between this peak and the mountains behind it. I'm using a light grey, a warmer light grey, to maybe add some indications of rocks here and there, like maybe there are some rocky parts of this mountain here and there. Not really sure if I'm going to keep all of those, but I just made some parts of it a bit lighter. Now here and there I'm just going to draw a few of these clusters of trees, a few of them in a group. And here on this shadow side I'm going to draw some more trees, but these will have to be darker because they are all in the shadow, so I'm using a bit more of the black colored pencil. I also use that black colored pencil at the bottom of some of these trees on the lighter side of the mountain. So I think that now the shadow side is really starting to stand in contrast against the light side, which is very good, because that's what I wanted to achieve. And I'm adding a touch of this bluish color to some parts of the mountain, especially the shadow side. I'm going to draw some more trees here at the bottom of this slope here, closer to our viewpoint. And these are going to appear slightly taller and larger because obviously because of the perspective they are closer to us, so they are going to appear larger. And I'm going to keep adding some more just to make this bottom part of the scene a little more interesting, because I don't want this to be an empty space, just an empty slope. I did add a little bit of variation with those colors, especially the brown. So now the slope looks a little bit more interesting, but with a few more trees here and there I think it'll look even better. Now another important touch is adding a little bit of shadow under them, but the shadow is being cast from left to right because our light source is on the left. So if I draw a little bit of shadow like this, everything starts to look more three-dimensional. These are just some very small touches, fine touches, but they add a lot to the realism of the scene. And the eye does pick up on them, even if they don't really know what's going on. I'm adding some even lighter touches with this light yellow colored pencil around the edges of that ridge, just to enhance that contrast between the light side and the shadow side. And I reworked the shadow side a little bit by adding some more trees there and adding some slightly warmer colors than I initially had in there. But once I'm finished with that, this whole thing will be done. I'm doing a little bit of refining on these mountains in the distance, and just trying to make sure that I have a cleaner edge between the tops of those closer mountains which are closer to us, because those are going to be a bit better defined, and I do want a little bit more contrast between them and the background or the mountains behind them, mountain peaks behind them. So I'm just sort of polishing that part of the drawing. This is what the finished drawings look like. I hope you found this drawing process, this tutorial, useful. If you want to see longer videos, don't forget to check out my Patreon. And of course, I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.